Purchase the book at www.rockandrollunraveled.com. Follow them at Twitter at R&R Unraveled, and look them up on Facebook at Rock and Roll Unraveled.
Rock and Roll Unraveled.
By author Derek Shelmerdine.
Available now.
I think of myself more as a song and dance man, you know.
The only reason that we are still together is that the subtlety of delicate change in the music.
Some of it's old, some of it's new, something borrowed, something brown.
Let's say you have a band that wears makeup, and you've got snakes, and you've got guillotines, and you've got really hard rock, Detroit rock and roll.
All those groups and people that started off when we were starting off, we're all still going.
It's funny how many times rock and roll's been dead. Yeah, how many times people have said it's been dead, it just keeps coming back like a bloody phoenix.
Rock and roll!
I mean, the Mamas and the Papas were really the first band to get involved, and it was very much John Phillips and Lou Adler who were the guys behind the festival. So they got to close the festival, of course. It's always good when you've got your own particular band that's appearing. Because they started off with hits back in early '66 with California Dreaming, and they had 5 more hits before the festival. So they were one of the few really established bands at the gig. But they're not on. Well, they're not on tour. But interestingly enough, relatives or descendants are on tour in a band called Wilson Phillips. There's Carney and Wendy Wilson, daughters of Brian, and China Phillips, daughter of John Phillips. And they're actually playing. They've only got one gig I can find listed at the moment. That's in California on the 15th of July at Libya Bowl in, I think it's pronounced Ojai, O-J-A-I. That is certainly where it's a good place to be on the 15th of July if you fancy seeing Wilson Phillips on tour. But the gig itself was actually kicked off by a band called The Association. They'd had a hit about a year earlier with Along Comes Mary, and they had a hit just around the time of the festival with Windy. That gave them a number 1, actually. So it's interesting that a lot of bands had their first hit records, and certainly their first number 1s as a result of being on the band. And they're actually on the festival. They're on tour as well, The Association at the moment. You can see them in the USA, Canada, and then back to the USA, 7th of June to the 20th of October. Most of the bands who are playing, which is really interesting, 50 years on, they're still touring, often with some of the original members. You can get detailed information about where the venues are and the prices. Well, not so much the prices, but certainly the tour itself from the website on www.rockandrollunraveled.com.
One of my favorite websites.
Thank you, sir.
Filled with information, Derek, and you do a really great job at all your social media.
It's really interesting delving into stuff, but really now we come to 2 of the most dramatic performances at the festival. I mean, that was the Who and Jimi Hendrix, neither of which were known at all when in America when they arrived at the festival. In fact, the Who had their first hit just in the wake, Happy Jack, just in the wake of the festival, but they were completely unknown. But what's interesting is they both knew of each other in the UK, and they both knew that they each had very, very dramatic stage performances. Jimi Hendrix had already started setting fire to his guitar in the UK, and at this time the Who was still smashing up their entire set of equipment at the end of a gig. So neither of them were keen to follow each other. So
that becomes an expensive tour. You know? How many Fender guitars were burned to death by Jimmy?
Well, most of them, it's only superficial sort of paint damage, fortunately. But the Who's is a bit more significant. The poor old roadies would spend hours afterwards sticking stuff back together, mending speakers, because Townsend had a habit of sticking his guitar through the speaker. Well, what happened is apparently they tossed a coin and the Who went on before Hendrix. Usually the argument is about who goes on last. It's interesting, this one was the Who goes on first. But they went on with the Grateful Dead in between them. And they finished up with the guitar and equipment, drum particularly, smashing My Generation. And Roger Daltrey's on tour at the moment. He's in America from the 8th of June to the 18th of August, and he's performing Tommy, which would be well worth catching.
Yeah, there's a lot of good tours this summer, and I'm sure we're going to get to a lot of them here.
Oh, absolutely. And what's interesting there, if you go to, the Who's website, which is what my link takes it to, and you sort of click on more information about the gigs, what he seems to be doing is, instead of taking a particular orchestra on tour, he seems to be performing with a different number of orchestras. So somehow they're getting the local orchestra is getting itself sorted out to back in when the tour rolls into that particular town.
No, that's actually a good idea, because then you don't have to worry about the travel expenses. And most of these orchestras, I mean, they're all professionals, and they know it doesn't take them long to learn music.
Yeah, I mean, they'll just read it. Absolutely superb. And, I mean, Hendrix was interesting. He was introduced by Brian Jones. And it's interesting that it was Brian Jones very much, they couldn't get a work visa, but obviously he could get a personal visa, as it were. And he introduced Hendrix. And Paul McCartney and Andrew Oldham, the Stones manager, I mean, they were both very, very keen that Jimi Hendrix appeared at the festival. I mean, they were both on that board of governors. But what's interesting, I mean, Hendrix was completely unknown in America, even though for about 3 years earlier he'd been in the backing band of people like Otis Redding, Sam Cooke, and the Isley Brothers. He'd recorded with the Isley Brothers. But it wasn't until he went over to the UK, Chas Chandler took him over, that he actually found success. And for this concert, he was billed as From London, England, the Jimi Hendrix Experience.
From London, England?
Yeah, so it was as though he was a British band. So
but he's actually from Seattle.
That's right. Yeah, and he'd been very active for a good 3 years before he found success in the UK.
Well, that's interesting. You know, when you talk about Jimi Hendrix, he gets all the credit for the band, but, you know, his drummer, when you're talking about great drummers, Mitch Mitchell was magnificent. Absolutely. I mean, when you... It's easy to find the famous... He burns his guitar at the festival while he's playing Wild Thing, made famous by the Trogs a year or so earlier, or a little bit earlier. But what's interesting is, obviously, while he's busy setting fire to it, all that's left playing is the drums and the bass guitar, and the sound is just so full. I mean, they were certainly one of the best rhythm sections ever to hit the rock and roll world. Yeah, and that was a 3-piece band.
Absolutely. It's unbelievable to think about how much noise they could make. Absolutely amazing.
Those days of rock and roll.
Absolutely. But Mickey Dolenz from the Monkees, he was actually at the gig, and he saw Hendrix and thought, this guy's good. So he invited him to join them as the opening act on the Monkees tour that was about to start. I think this was the Monkees' first tour, must have been.
Right. We talked about that a few months back, and the crowd didn't receive him as well as they received the Monkees.
Well, no, I mean, he actually got very bored. The reason he left the tour early was basically because he got a bit fed up of playing his entire set through the teenage would be putting the age a little bit high, but 8 to sort of 14-year-old, mostly girls, chanting, "We want the Monkees." So he thought, time to move on. But what was interesting was an Australian journalist lady called Lillian Roxon, and she wrote an article that suggested that the Daughters of the American Revolution had put pressure on the promoters because of Jimi Hendrix's very sexual performance to pull him off the concert. And for years, that's been very much the urban, and still is,
an urban myth that was why Jimi Hendrix left the gig. But it was actually because of We Want the Monkeys. There's only so many times you can play to that as a background, because he left on friendly terms with the guys.
Yeah, the musics were, just two different genres of rock and roll, and I can't see them mixing very well just in hindsight. So, on top of all that, where the fans are going to see the Monkees, it's like, the music probably wasn't appealing to the crowd as much either.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The Beatles would have been better to join up with in that regard if the Beatles were around.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, they'd have been very, very popular. I think the Monkees would have struggled a bit if the Beatles had been on the same bill. Although, they're an interesting band, the Monkees. And, in fact, Mike Nesmith and Mickey Dolenz are actually on tour in America and Canada from the 1st to the 25th of June. And if you read what they say about the tour, Mike Nesmith, because he was the first to leave the Monkees, and he was always the one who... Because he was a professional musician, unlike the other two, certainly Dolenz, who was a child actor, and Davy Jones was a child actor. Mike Nesmith was very much a songwriter, country artist, and quite popular on the sort of, folk rather than country, I suppose, on the folk circuit. But they're on tour, and he's very keen to point out that this isn't a Monkees tour. This is two of the Monkees playing Monkees material. And it's the first time they've ever actually toured as a duo.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And Peter Tork apparently wasn't there because he got a Lead Belly tribute album coming up, and he wants to focus on that. Is the reason I read that he won't be on this tour in June.
You're talking the blues artist Lead Belly?
Yeah.
So he's doing a tribute album for that artist, eh?
Yeah, apparently he's working on it at the moment. It's going to be called Relax Your Mind. I'm not sure if it's actually released yet, but the reports I read were suggesting that he was working on it right now.
Funny story about Lead Belly, just real quick. I had never heard of the artist, and I'm a big fan of the Sanford & Son TV series. Well, Fred Sanford, Red Fox, had brought him up in one of his episodes, so it got me curious. Next thing I know, I was listening to Lead Belly.
Yeah. Well, he was,
and I'm Potbelly.
Absolutely. He was very influential. I mean, it was one of his songs that kick-started British rock and roll. A guy called Lonnie Donegan recorded Rock Island Line, a Lead Belly song. In fact, there was Lead Belly on both sides of the single. And it was that song that's credited with kick-starting skiffle and British rock and roll in the UK. So, I mean, the guy is well worth hunting down and listening to. He comes from the sort of folk blues tradition. And he was another one along with... He used to play a lot with Pete Seeger. And, Pete Seeger got blacklisted again this time and earlier in the 60s and the 50s. And Lead Belly was another one that got blacklisted in the sort of McCarthy witch hunts in the sort of late 50s, early 60s. So he's very much part of that whole scene.
Interesting.
But poor old Grateful Dead. I mean, the event was filmed, and Grateful Dead refused to have their set filmed, and they were between The Who and Jimi Hendrix. And in an interview, I think it was a Rolling Stone, Phil Lesh says Grateful Dead didn't deliver. And he sort of explained that, well, who's ever going to remember Grateful Dead when they play between The Who and Jimi Hendrix?
No kidding, eh?
Yeah, absolutely. Grateful Dead, they really weren't happy with the gig they did. But they're on tour. They call themselves pretty much Dead and Company now. And it's like a sort of loose ensemble, I think, of various people who've been associated with the Grateful Dead. And you can see them in America, 30th of May through to the 14th of July. But they're another one of these bands who are on the road pretty much all the time. So it's a good idea just to keep, once you've got the address, just keep checking those dates, because I'm pretty sure that the 14th of July will just keep on extending.
they took a little break there after Jerry Garcia passed away, but they were a pretty active band all through the 90s and in the 80s. They didn't, like a lot of bands faded away. The